And the next one is Giorgio, who is recently, since yesterday, a doctor indeed, and will illustrate his work and give us some tools, which is the first one, perhaps. And so George has been my collaborator for a long time, and now he's at University of Florence. And yeah.
Good afternoon. I'm very glad to present this work in which we are leveraging a screening algorithm to try to estimate the sensitivity of another algorithm, a main algorithm. And I think I skipped the background. We already know that we already understood that case finding algorithms are often inaccurate. I may add just that a researcher in the process of defining a case finding algorithm often face a trade-off between errors, between sensitivity and specificity. And the usual strategy in pharmacoepidemiology research is to define a very specific algorithm, and that may come at the expense of the sensitivity. So there are reasons to adopt this strategy, and the main reason is that if we can assume that the sensitivity is non-differential, the sensitivity is equal across exposure group, I can still have correct measure of association like ratio of risk, even if the sensitivity of the algorithm is very low. But there are consequences. The first one is that we cannot estimate number of cases, prevalence, and incidence if I have a high specificity and a low sensitivity. And also, I can estimate risk ratio, but I have to assume that the sensitivity is non-differential. And for other measure of association, like risk difference, I can estimate them, even if the sensitivity is not differential, they would be underestimated, at least in absolute value. So the objective of this work is to develop a methodology to reduce the bias from low sensitivity and to develop a test for the assumption of non-differential sensitivity of a main algorithm. So quickly, the methods is that one we build on a strategy suggested by Lane and Bichler, in which we develop a screening algorithm. In this representation, A is the main algorithm that is very specific, and B is the screening algorithm that aims at retrieving few more cases that are not identified by A. Then we perform a validation study on positive predictive value of both A and B, and then we develop formula to estimate the sensitivity of A using the positive predictive value. So we need to introduce the composite algorithm. If we have defined A and B, we can define the algorithm A union B and A intersection B. And we may focus a bit on A union B, that is the algorithm that retrieve all the cases that are identified by A or B, and we are going to make some assumption about this algorithm. So A or B is the middle one. So very quickly, we exploit relationship between sensitivity. We can state that the sensitivity of A union B is equal to the sensitivity of A plus the sensitivity of B minus the sensitivity of A intersection B. That is very analogous to the probability of union of events. And also we can exploit the interrelationship between validity indices that we just saw. And using that, we can express the sensitivity of a main algorithm as a function of the positive predictive value and the observed prevalence that are known. And in order to do that, we have to assume that the sensitivity of A union B is equal to 1. That means that the union of my very specific algorithm and my screening algorithm can retrieve all the cases of interest. If we cannot state that, we still can get an upper bound for the sensitivity, and we still can exploit the upper bound of the sensitivity to reduce the underestimation. So in this work, we explore different scenarios. So the first one that is very straightforward, we can exploit the sensitivity of A to correct the number of cases and the risk. And if the sensitivity of A union B is equal to 1, everything is unbiased. I get the correct number of cases and I get the correct risk. But if we cannot assume that, I still can get an upper bound from the sensitivity, and I can reduce the underestimation of number of cases and risk, finding a lower bound. We went a bit further in scenarios in which the population is stratified per exposure, and we study how we can leverage this methodology to correct risk ratio, risk difference, and how to test for differentiality of the sensitivity of the main algorithm. So still, if we can state that the sensitivity of A union B is equal to 1, we can get a correct estimate of risk ratio and risk difference, even if the sensitivity of the main algorithm is differential. And if we cannot state that, we may assume that the sensitivity of A union B is less than 1, but it is non-differential. In this case, if the sensitivity of A union B is non-differential, I can get an unbiased estimate of the risk ratio. I can get a lower bound in absolute value. I can still test if the sensitivity of A is differential. And if I cannot state that the sensitivity of A union B is non-differential, I can do nothing. I am in the same scenario in which I have no screening algorithm. So I'll show you very quickly how we define and test the non-differentiality test. We define the null hypothesis. The sensitivity ratio -1 is simply the non-differential, the assumption of non-differential sensitivity. We rewrite this ratio as a function of the positive predictive value and observed prevalence using the same methodology, and then we conduct this simulation study performing the test with the bootstrap method. We didn't specify any probability distribution, we just used the bootstrap method, and then we computed the power of the test across different scenarios that we may think reflect real case study. I did not report the results for a matter of time, but I can just say that the power of the test behaved as we expected. When we go away from the sensitivity ratio equal 1, the power of the test increase, the power of the test increase as the sample size increase, and in this scenario in which the sensitivity ratio is close to 1, the power of the test really depends on this scenario, but it's a bit complicated to go through all the parameters that we used. So there are some notes on the assumption. The assumption of non-differentiality of the sensitivity of A is not always realistic, especially in safety study. So knowing that a patient use a new medication or use a medication with a suspected adverse reaction may lead the coder or the physician or the people that report the code to be more specific, to use a very specific diagnostic code, and that may introduce non-differential sensitivity. And the assumption that make our work perfect is that the assumption of the sensitivity A union B equal 1, and that is also not always realistic. But in some particular scenario, may be likely. For example, in scenario in which I'm studying infarction and my screening algorithm is the death. And the sensitivity, the last assumption that we cited is that the sensitivity of A union B is not 1, but is not differential. And this assumption may be likely in several scenarios, maybe more likely than the assumption of non-differentiality of A. There are scenarios in which the exposure do not affect, maybe coming back to the slide of Rosa, the exposure do not affect the action of the patient. So the sensitivity, the differentiality is not about the coder that behave differently about knowing an exposure. So here is a real case study. In Entresto study, we tried to apply our methodology. The outcome of interest was angioedema, and we defined a main algorithm, a code that we thought was specific, that was a diagnostic code for angioneurotic edema, and then we defined a screening algorithm that are a list of code for hypersensitivity. In this case, the assumption of A union B equal to 1 would imply that all the subjects with angioedema accessed the hospital and were diagnosed with one of the code included in one of those list of codes. So here are the results. Through the algorithm, we identified 34 cases and 441 cases for angioedema and hypersensitivity respectively. Then we validated all the cases of angioedema and 96 cases of hypersensitivity. We compute the true positive and we compute the positive predictive value of both. The positive predictive value of the algorithm angioedema was 34%, a bit lower than expected, and the positive predictive value of the hypersensitivity was 8.3%. Then we applied our formula and we estimate an upper bound for the sensitivity that is 24%. That is the upper bound for the sensitivity of the algorithm angioedema. So we explored this upper bound and we found a lower bound for the number of cases. The number of cases initially retrieved was 34, And even if the PPV was low, the number of cases that we expect now is greater than 49. So there are a few limitations of this work. We still require some assumption, and the methodology does not cover all the scenario. We assume that the exposure wasn't misclassified, and we did not cover the hazard ratio scenario. But estimate on validity indices can be integrated into quantitative Bayesian analysis, and we can get a better understanding of the scenario of the misclassification. And all the codes that we have developed are available on GitHub. So that's all. I have a few questions for the investigator and for the researcher. The first one for the investigator: is it possible to conduct a validation study for the main outcome variable, and can it be done stratified by exposure? And if so, could the screening algorithm be defined even with limited specificity, would still identify some true cases missed by the primary algorithm? And if so, can we assume that the sensitivity of A union B is non-differential? So for the researcher, is it possible that there is a delay in detecting events, and how this delay can be managed? And what happens if the delay in detecting events is differential, depends on some exposure? And can we envision how to estimate a possible delay and adjust the analysis? So thank you for your attention.
So, Giorgio, we expect that this is what you want to do in your postdoc, right? So that's clear enough, Ercilia and Robert. So that's I have an immediate comment, and then in the audience, if somebody wants also to comment. Vera, you mentioned the problem of not having enough information. This was let's say a study we did in the heat of COVID. It was very complicated. We tried to do what we could do, and this is why we found ppvs that are so low. The reason was that we consider non-accessible cases as non-cases. So this is why this justifies why ppvs are really exaggerating low. However, nevertheless, it's really interesting, I think, that we did find some cases in the hypersensitivity in the screening algorithm. And this, of course, since the screening algorithm is so much more prevalent than the narrow algorithm, even few cases that we found eventually represented many cases, and more cases than we had found in the screening in the narrow algorithm. So that's a thing. I think a lesson learned that probably in the pipeline that Amir illustrated, something we really need to think about is, since at the end of the day this is not clinical trial, we don't have often the information. Of course, we need to make assessor as homogeneous as possible, but many times they will just agree that the information is not sufficient. So what do we do in that case? Do we really accept that all the non-accessible are non-cases? This is probably not realistic. But if we don't make this assumption, what is the assumption that we make? So that was a comment on these numbers that may scare people that look at our study. Is there any other immediate reaction on Giorgio's presentation? Clarification on the test? Yes, please, Vin. Oh, you can ask as many questions as you wish. I mean, you came all the way from New Jersey, you know.
So the two questions are, since you mentioned that there was a number of cases that were unable to be adjudicated because there was insufficient data, do you have the recalculated indices excluding those? No. Okay. Second question, just curious, since Rosa had mentioned, this is going to be the focus of your postdoc. If the indices that you showed were not attributed to charts that were unable to be collected, what would you recommend that should be done next, if anything, to refine the algorithms to see could the indices be improved, sensitivity? Is there anything that could be done? Could you refine algorithms? Were there poor performing codes?
Yeah, I think I got your question. I think that may come back to the transportability of the algorithm that you was talking about before. So in order to define an algorithm, and in this case, in order to refine an algorithm, we need to have a deep knowledge of the data source and a knowledge of how the record has been generated and how the record has been prompted. So maybe in order to define the first algorithm, we should like get the whole process of action that prompt record that then create an indicator, and maybe we can do it iteratively. We do a first round of defining the algorithm, and if it doesn't work, exactly, we can do it again. Yeah, but yeah, that needs and maybe this process will help you get to know better your data source. Maybe so. Maybe okay. Thank you.